Citing the salaries paid to some chief executives and footballers as utterly ridiculous, Jeremy Corbyn this morning called for a wage cap to be imposed on the country's biggest wage earners. But by this afternoon, he appeared to have rowed back considerably after his former advisor, the one-time Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee member Danny Blanchflower, branded the idea totally unworkable. Here, first of all, is what the Labour leader told Sarah Jane and me this morning.
In the first 3 days of this year, many top executives have already earned as much as the rest are going to earn in a whole year. Surely this has to be addressed.
What would be the cap then? Because you could argue that if you cut off all those top earners, all those fat cats, those top executives, they pay the top level of income tax. So you'll be missing quite a bit of money from them. How would you make that up?
Well, they would be obviously having slightly less of their enormous pay levels, which would then be available for investment and development of their companies or indeed our society as a whole.
But it would go back into the company. It wouldn't go to benefit the taxpayer.
Well, actually, an economic development does benefit the taxpayer because more people work and more people get jobs as a result of that and therefore pay taxes. And so we'd have an expanding economy.
But later in Mr Corbyn's big policy speech this afternoon came this.
You could set a limit on top pay. I think it's probably better to look at the ratio issue because that indeed would then encourage wage rises lower down and ensure a better sharing of the resources and the profits of any company.
So if Mr Corbyn does take the idea further, does it make economic sense? Ben Wilmot is the head of public policy at the CIPD, the professional body for human resources, and in our central London studio is Steve Davis from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Well, Ben, let me start with you. It sounds as though Mr Corbyn's already rowed back on this. I mean, nowhere else in the world really has this apart from Cuba and Egypt, do they?
No, I think he's basically raising attention on this sort of growing disconnect between top pay and average pay, and certainly CIPD research shows that 7 in 10 employees believe chief executive pay is too high, and 6 in 10 say the level of chief executive pay is a demotivating factor in the workplace. So I think there is definitely a real need to look at pay and whether chief execs are being paid proportionately to the contribution of the wider workforce and particularly in relation to the performance of the organisation.
OK, Steve, I mean, clearly we've heard from Ben here the idea is unworkable. That's what most top economists are saying, this idea of a wage cap. But do you accept Ben's point that something needs to be done? There is clearly discontent about top pay, isn't there?
Well, there may be discontent, but it's not clear that there's really a problem. I mean, what is driving top pay, not just in commerce, but as you rightly say, in sport and law and quite a number of other areas, is the fact that increasingly we live in a globalised world. And so law firms, football teams, companies are in a global market for talent. And given that we're competing with China, North America, other parts of the world, this is inevitably going to drive up pay at the very top. Now, even if you do think there's a problem, though, it's not at all clear to me, to put it mildly, that this is any business of the government. The people who should be concerned about it, if it is a problem, are the shareholders in the companies in question, and they're the people who should be acting if there's a problem. There's no role for the government in this area, in my view. Do
you think the shareholders are doing enough?
Well, quite frankly, no. At the moment, we're not seeing shareholders using their ability to have a binding vote on pay. I think there's a case to look at how frequently shareholders can have a binding vote on pay. But I do think that the key thing is about performance. And if you look at the performance of corporations, FTSE 100 corporations, relative to the rewards of chief executives over the last 2 decades, the rewards of chief executives have outstripped performance. And at a time we've got a productivity problem in the UK, certainly that is part of the mix. So, and I think the other thing is in terms of talent, the war for talent. Very interesting research by the LSE last year, based on interviews with large executive search companies responsible for appointing about 70% of FTSE 100 chief executives over the last few years. That research found that headhunters themselves say that the level of high pay is absurdly high. And they also said that for every chief executive they appoint, they could find 100 equally capable candidates. So, of course, we need talented, hard-working chief executives but they are not another species.
But, I mean, Steve, that would kind of give the lie to your point about it being a global market for talent, wouldn't it, if there are plenty of other people available to do some of these jobs?
Well, there are always plenty of people available to do jobs at a particular salary. The question is whether or not they're as good as the people you actually appoint in the end. Now, the argument that's being made here is that essentially there's no difference between the people you pick and the next 19 or 20 on the list. Sometimes that is true, but the thing is there is a relatively small number of people who really do make a difference, and that's true whether you're talking about senior management or top football players or top lawyers. Now, the thing is you really want to try and get hold of those people. Very often you're going to narrowly miss out on them, or you'll appoint somebody who you think on the basis of their CV is in that category, but they're not. But it's the rewards that those small number of exceptional people get that tends to drive the market for everybody else. That's the nature of a market in top talent, I'm afraid. Now, obviously there are problems in terms of, as was mentioned by Ben, the demotivating effect this may have on people lower down the salary scale. But I think that is something that shareholders need to perhaps take into account. And also, I would say, there is a tendency for companies to use the pay of their senior managers as a kind of signal that they're not an average company by paying above the average. And of course that's mathematically impossible. There have to be some companies that are paying the average salary. So there is a certain element of an arms race here, but I think that's overstated. I think it is rather the competition for that small number of what you might call superstars, or to identify superstars, that's driving this.